He thought the nightmare would end after the arrest, after the flashing lights faded, after the headlines stopped screaming his name. But for Bryan Kohberger, the nightmare has only just begun. Inside these walls, time doesn't move, it crawls. Every second echoes louder than the last. The same four walls. The same concrete bed. The same cold silence. And a name that no one in here dares to speak aloud, that he's held alone. No roommates, no laughter, no voices but his own. Just a meal tray slid through a slot, and the weight of everything waiting outside those bars. The walls may look ordinary, but they hold a kind of punishment words can't describe. Because this isn't just prison, this is purgatory. The man who once studied killers now lives among them. The student of criminal minds has become the subject himself. And every day inside this maximum security prison, he learns a new lesson about fear, power, and silence. What happens to a man accused of one of America's most haunting crimes when the cameras disappear? What happens when justice doesn't end with a sentence but begins with it? Tonight, we go inside Bryan Kohberger's prison life. A life many say is worse than the death penalty itself. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to see isn't just another crime story, it's a look inside the human mind when the world turns its back. Before the prison walls, before the mugshot, before the nation even knew his name, Bryan Kohberger was just another student. Quiet, focused, curious. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1994, to an ordinary family, not the kind that makes headlines. His childhood, by most accounts, was unremarkable. A boy who kept to himself, who sometimes struggled to fit in, but who always seemed to observe everything around him. Some called him shy. Others said he carried a kind of intensity that made them uneasy. He studied psychology first, then moved toward criminology, a field meant to understand the criminal mind. He wanted to know what drove people to kill, to lie, to hide. It wasn't just curiosity, it was obsession. Former classmates remember him asking deep, uncomfortable questions. He wanted to understand what it feels like to take another person's life. At the time, it sounded academic. Today, it sounds haunting. By 2022, Kohberger had moved across the country to Washington State University. There, he worked as a teaching assistant, grading papers, leading discussions on criminal behavior. He lived just minutes away from the University of Idaho campus, minutes away from where everything would change. People who knew him back then describe him in two ways, either distant and polite or strange and cold. He would stare too long, talk too little. And when he did speak, it was often about control, power, and human nature. He seemed fascinated not by the victims of crime, but by the perpetrators. What made them tick? How they thought. How they got away. It was as if, in studying monsters, he was learning how to become one. He earned top grades, even as he grew more isolated. He lost weight, began changing his habits, and spoke less and less with people outside his studies. Some say he was preparing for a future in criminal psychology. Others believe he was rehearsing something else entirely. And now, years later, as he sits behind concrete walls and iron doors, the irony is almost poetic. A man who studied killers, now surrounded by them. A man who dissected crime scenes, now living in the aftermath of one. But even behind bars, his mind hasn't stopped analyzing. Even in silence, he's still observing, still watching, still trying to understand what happens next. Was Bryan Kohberger born to be this way, or did his obsession with the darkest corners of human behavior slowly pull him in? That's the question that still haunts every classroom he once sat in. Coming up, the night that changed everything. How a quiet college town went from peaceful to petrified, and how one man's curiosity became a national horror. It was a cold November night in Moscow, Idaho, the kind of night when the streets are quiet and the town feels safe. Students studied, some laughed over late-night pizza, others fell asleep with exams on their minds. It was supposed to be another ordinary night in a peaceful college town. But by dawn, nothing about Moscow would ever feel safe again. In the early hours of November 13, 2022, for University of Idaho students, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernadel, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Goncalves lost their lives inside a small off-campus home on King Road. They were young, full of promise, with futures waiting just beyond graduation. And then, in one unimaginable moment, their lives were gone. When the police arrived, what they saw inside that house would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. The walls told a story too terrible to repeat in detail. The officer stepped into a silence that felt heavy, almost sacred, a silence filled with questions that no one could answer. Who could have done this? Why them? Why here? The town woke up to sirens and confusion. Parents called their children, desperate to hear their voices. Students packed their bags, afraid to stay another night. Rumors spread faster than facts, and fear settled like fog over every conversation. 4 days there was nothing. No suspect, no motive, just an aching emptiness where answers should have been. Behind the scenes, investigators began piecing together fragments of evidence. DNA, footprints, security footage. They worked through the night, chasing threads that led nowhere, trying to make sense of something senseless. Every detail mattered, but none were enough. The faces of the victims appeared on every screen, their smiles frozen in time. And somewhere out there the person responsible walked free. Then came the clue. A white Hyundai Elantra. A simple car, captured briefly on a security camera near the house in the dark hours of that night. It wasn't proof. But it was something, a direction, a lead. Detectives began tracing every white Elantra registered in the region, narrowing thousands down to a few, then to one. Each mile of that search brought them closer to a name that no one had yet connected to the case. Bryan Kohberger. A graduate student living less than 15 minutes away, studying criminology, the science of crime, the study of killers, the patterns of violence. He taught classes on criminal behavior. He studied the psychology of murderers. And as investigators would soon learn, he drove a white Hyundai Elantra. They began to watch him. Carefully. Quietly. They followed his car. Collected his trash. Tested the DNA. Each piece of evidence began to fall into place, each one painting a darker picture. By late December they had enough. And as the country prepared to celebrate the new year, a small team of officers prepared for an arrest that would stop the nation cold. It was just before dawn on December 30, 2022, in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. A quiet home. A quiet street. Snow blanketing the roofs, the world still asleep. Then headlights cut through the dark. Doors slammed. Boots crunched against ice. The silence was broken by the words every suspect dreads. Police. Search warrant. Bryan Kohberger was found inside his parents' house. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, awake, alert, expressionless. For a man accused of the unthinkable, there was no panic, no confusion, only calm. As officers led him away in handcuffs, the flashing lights reflected off the snow like distant camera flashes from a world he could no longer control. By morning, his face was everywhere. Every screen, every headline, every whisper. The criminology student accused of committing the very crimes he once studied. The scholar turned suspect. The observer turned participant. When those steel bars shut behind him, the sound echoed far beyond that small county jail. It was the sound of finality, the moment when study turned to sentence, when theory became reality. Bryan Kohberger's world, once filled with lectures and research papers, had been reduced to a concrete cell and the weight of silence. The door closed. And in that instant everything changed. For him. For the victims' families. And for a town that would never sleep as peacefully again. The ride from Pennsylvania to Idaho was long, quiet, and suffocating. Every turn of the tires seemed to drag the silence tighter around him. No one spoke much. No one needed to. The air between the agents and Bryan Kohberger was heavy enough to speak on its own. He stared ahead for most of the journey, motionless, almost studying his own downfall like it was a case file. The man who once analyzed killers now sat cuffed, watched, and transported like one. Every sound, the clinking of the chains, the hum of the engine, the faint radio static, was a reminder that his world was no longer his own. When he arrived at the Latah County Jail, the night air was sharp and thin. The flashing lights from the convoy danced against the cold concrete walls of the facility. Inside, guards were waiting, silent, prepared, alert. They'd handled criminals before, but this one was different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He was calm, too calm that he was processed like any other inmate. Fingerprints. Mugshot. A search. But behind every procedure was an unspoken tension. The awareness that this was the Bryan Kohberger, the man whose face had filled the news for weeks, whose story had gripped an entire nation. His cell was small. Bare. A single bed. A metal sink. A toilet bolted to the wall. No clock. No window with a view. Only a narrow slit that let in a pale, colorless light. The silence was deafening. Even the hum of the fluorescent bulbs seemed to echo. For the first time, Bryan Kohberger was completely alone. No classmates to discuss theories with. No lectures to lead. No way to explain what he claimed to understand so deeply, the criminal mind. That he wasn't placed with other inmates. Not for safety. But for survival. Guards knew what would happen if word spread that he was among them. The accused killer of 4 innocent college students, in a small-town jail filled with men who had nothing left to lose. So they kept him apart, sealed away from the rest, watched every hour of the day. Meals were slid through a slot in the door. Showers were taken under supervision. Every movement was recorded. And when he spoke, it was brief, polite, distant, measured. To the guards, he seemed emotionless. No anger. No fear. No regret. He read books, took notes, wrote letters. Like a man still conducting research, only now the subject was himself. Inside those walls, time slowed to a crawl. Days blended into nights. The silence pressed harder. And as the investigation outside grew louder, as reporters filled every courthouse step, as families cried for justice, inside his cell he remained quiet, unmoved, unchanged. Some guards whispered that he rarely slept. That at night he paced his cell, tracing invisible patterns along the wall with his fingertips. Others said he spent hours staring into the small security camera above his bed, as if trying to read the faces on the other side of the lens. Every sound in the hallway made him flinch just slightly, the metallic echo of a key turning, the shuffle of boots, the distant buzz of another door opening. He was living inside the same environment he'd once studied on paper. The theories of isolation. The breakdown of the mind under confinement. Now it wasn't research. It was reality. Each morning began the same way. Lights on, breakfast tray, silence. Each night ended the same way. Lights out, footsteps fading, silence again. And somewhere in that endless stillness, something in him began to change. That he was no longer the student. No longer the observer. He had become the subject. Behind those concrete walls, he faced not only the weight of his alleged crimes but the slow erosion of his own mind. Because in solitary confinement, time isn't measured in hours, it's measured in thoughts. And when thoughts are all you have, they can turn on you. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And though the world outside kept moving with news reports, legal motions and public outrage, inside Latah County Jail, Bryan Kohberger's world had frozen in place. That he lived inside his head now. Haunted not by voices but by silence. And it's that silence that would follow him, all the way to the prison where even silence can scream. Inside the Latah County Jail, every day follows the same rhythm. Slow, cold, and predictable. A life stripped of freedom, but more than that, stripped of meaning. Each morning begins not with sunlight, but with the harsh flicker of fluorescent bulbs. The hum of electricity fills the air before he even opens his eyes. There is no sunrise here, only light that never truly feels alive. Breakfast arrives at precisely 6:30 a.m. A metal slot slides open and a tray is pushed through, oatmeal, bread, a plastic spoon. No words. No eye contact. Only the sound of metal meeting metal as the slot shuts again. For the rest of the morning, there is nothing but stillness. The cell measures just a few paces across. Concrete on every side. A thin mattress. A steel toilet. Every sound he makes, every breath, every cough, bounces back at him. In this place, even silence echoes. That he spends 23 hours a day locked inside. No human contact. No conversations. Only the distant sound of doors opening and closing somewhere down the corridor. Sometimes he hears the muffled shouts of other inmates, anger, laughter, madness, all blending into the mechanical rhythm of prison life. That 1 hour outside the cell, the so-called yard time, comes once a day if at all. He walks out under the watch of armed guards into a narrow, fenced concrete pen. There's no real yard, no open field, no trees. Just a sky divided by steel mesh. He walks in slow circles, the air cold and thin, before being led back inside. Everything is controlled. Every move recorded. There is nowhere to go, nothing to do, and no one to talk to. Inmates call it living death. Guards call it procedure. But psychologists have another name for it: mental execution. Solitary confinement does not break the body. It breaks the mind. The hours become thoughts, the thoughts become voices, and the voices become memories that never stop replaying. He eats in silence. He reads in silence. He writes notes, reflections, fragments of thoughts. Sometimes he stares at the wall as if it might speak back. The guards say he rarely reacts. He doesn't yell, doesn't argue. He simply exists, a quiet figure moving between sleep, reading, and pacing. But inside, isolation is working its slow violence. Because when you are left alone long enough, even your heartbeat starts to sound like another person whispering your name. At night, the lights dim, but they never fully turn off. The security camera in the corner blinks every few seconds. Red, unblinking, watching. The sound of a guard's boots passing by the door marks the passage of time. The clang of a gate closing in the distance reminds him that somewhere life still exists. just not for him that he is a man under observation 24 hours a day, yet completely unseen. He is studied, monitored, analyzed, but never spoken to. For someone who once dedicated his life to understanding human behavior, there is a dark irony in his current reality. He now lives in a world without humanity. Some say this is justice. Others call it cruelty. But for Bryan Kohberger, it is his new existence. An endless cycle of repetition, reflection, and silence. Here, time does not move forward. It folds in on itself. Days repeat like pages stuck together in a book that can never be finished. And within that loop, the mind begins to unravel. Quietly, invisibly, completely. In prison, some find faith. Others find madness. What Bryan Kohberger finds remains unseen. But one thing is certain. Every passing day inside this cage is a sentence of its own. A punishment that, for some, is far worse than death. Inside his cell, time doesn't pass, it lingers. Every moment feels stretched as if the walls themselves are breathing. Days blend into one another until even the idea of time becomes uncertain. It's here, in this unending stillness, that Bryan Kohberger begins to face an enemy far more dangerous than confinement. His own mind. Guards who've observed him say he speaks very little. He answers questions when he must, but his tone is flat, emotionless, studied. To some, he seems calm, disturbingly calm. To others, it's the quiet of someone holding everything inside. They say he keeps his routines meticulous, his bed neatly made, his books stacked perfectly in order. Every action precise, controlled, almost ritualistic. He reads constantly, reports, legal documents, psychology texts. It's as though he's still analyzing, still studying patterns. Only this time the subject is himself. The same intellect that once disassembled the behavior of killers now circles endlessly around his own reflection. Psychologists call it self-looping, the mind folding back on itself in isolation, replaying the same thoughts until they begin to distort. It's a slow spiral, one that doesn't come with screams or outbursts but with silence. A silence that grows heavier by the hour. Experts who've studied long-term solitary confinement describe it as mental execution. They say that after weeks of sensory deprivation, the brain begins to create its own stimuli. Shadows move when nothing's there. Footsteps echo that no one has taken. And eventually thoughts begin to sound like voices. Kohberger hasn't shown open signs of breaking, not yet. But those who understand the psychology of confinement say it's only a matter of time. The human mind was never meant to be alone. When there's no one left to talk to, it starts talking to itself. A criminologist once said, "The body may survive solitary but the mind rarely does." And here, Bryan lives in near total isolation. No contact, no conversation, no escape. To outsiders it may look like justice served. To psychologists, it's something more complex. A punishment that stretches beyond physical walls, into the unseen corners of the human psyche. There are reports that he avoids eye contact with guards, often looking past them instead of at them. When he moves, it's deliberate, as though each motion has been calculated before it happens. He eats slowly, methodically, in complete silence. His notebooks, filled with dense writing and sketches, remain private, locked away with his personal belongings. Some say he's studying himself, observing the decline. Others think he's clinging to control, fighting the slow disintegration of thought that isolation brings. Psychologists who've examined death row inmates describe a similar pattern. In the beginning there's denial, then boredom, then anxiety, and finally a deep, quiet unraveling, a point where reality begins to blur with memory. Except here Bryan's fate is still undecided. He's not on death row, yet the conditions mimic it. The same walls, the same silence, the same endless waiting. Experts warn that the effects of solitary can become permanent. The brain changes, rewires itself under pressure. Sleep becomes fractured. Dreams become vivid. Voices echo long after the lights go out. In this space, the difference between living and existing fades. He isn't being tortured in the physical sense. No pain, no chains, no beatings. But the mind doesn't need violence to break. It just needs silence. And so, day after day, hour after hour, Bryan Kohberger sits in that silence. A man once obsessed with the psychology of killers now trapped inside the very study he used to conduct. His greatest experiment has become his punishment. And his own mind, the cage he cannot escape. Outside those cold walls, the world hasn't stopped watching. Every headline, every photo, every court appearance, dissected, debated, shared. The name Bryan Kohberger has become more than a man's name. It's a story. A symbol. A shadow stretching across the nation's collective mind. On social media, His face moves through endless timelines, reposted, analyzed, turned into theories and threads. Some call him a monster. Others, disturbingly, call him misunderstood. There are those who study his stare, his body language, his silence, searching for clues. And some, too many, turn their fascination into something darker. Admiration. In a world driven by curiosity and outrage, Bryan Kohberger sits at the center of both. His name trends whenever new details emerge. His mugshot becomes a kind of morbid icon, frozen between horror and intrigue. People discuss what he eats, how he speaks, what books he might be reading in his cell. The internet has turned his isolation into spectacle. Courtroom sketches go viral. Videos analyzing his every blink fill YouTube. Some frame it as justice being served. Others frame it as a tragedy for everyone involved. But beneath it all runs the same question. Why can't we look away? Why do we watch men like Bryan Kohberger so closely? What draws us to the darkness? Is it fear? Curiosity? Or something deeper? A need to understand what lies beyond the edge of reason. Human beings are drawn to the forbidden. We stare into the abyss not because we love it, but because it reflects something uncomfortable back at us. Our fascination with killers, with evil, with the unthinkable, it's a mirror. And each time we look, we see pieces of ourselves we wish weren't there. News outlets replay the footage. Him entering court, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on nothing. Pundits debate whether his silence is arrogance or fear. Podcasts unravel timelines, speculate motives, dig for clues. And through it all, his story continues to feed a machine, a cycle of horror and hunger that keeps the public watching. Outside the courthouse, strangers hold signs demanding justice. Online, others argue over evidence, theories, possibilities. For the victims' families, every new post is another wound opened again. For millions of others, it's entertainment cloaked as empathy. That there's something chilling in that truth. Because while the world watches him, every move, every word, every silence, he's watching too. In his cell, he reads. He knows how the media speaks about him. He knows how the internet debates him, how people analyze his past and profile his mind. He's studied how public attention turns criminals into characters. And now he's living proof of it, that calm, detached stare seen in every courtroom photo. Maybe it isn't emptiness. Maybe it's recognition. Maybe he understands the spectacle better than anyone else ever could. The cameras watch him. The nation watches him. And somewhere behind that steel door, he's watching us too. The cell is silent. But inside Bryan Kohberger's mind, the noise never stops. Before all of this, before the headlines, before the mugshots, he was a student of human behavior. He studied patterns, motives, the psychology of killers. He wanted to understand what drove people to cross that invisible line between thought and action. Now he lives on the other side of that line. Old professors remember him as analytical, distant. Always watching. Always questioning. His classmates described him as quiet, sometimes cold, sometimes strangely intense. He didn't just study crime. He dissected it. He wrote about emotion, empathy, control, the thin wires that hold a human being together. And now, in the stillness of confinement, he faces the very things he once examined under a microscope. Fear, isolation, guilt, powerlessness. He used to write about how killers think. Now he lives with the thoughts he used to analyze. The irony lingers in every breath he takes, every hour that crawls by behind the glass. Sometimes people say he stares for long periods, his expression unreadable. Maybe he's remembering the studies he once wrote. Or maybe he's conducting a new one, from within himself. The man who wanted to understand the darkness of others now lives consumed by his own. And in that silence he may finally understand what true loneliness feels like. The Idaho Maximum Security Institution is a world of its own, sealed, silent, and always watching. It's built for men society has chosen to forget. Every hallway hums with the low growl of electricity, every door heavier than the last. This is where Bryan Kohberger now lives. The inmates know his name, even if they've never seen his face. They whisper it in the chow line, in the laundry room, through vents that carry voices like ghosts. Some speak it with disgust, others with curiosity. But most speak it in silence. Few ever catch a glimpse of him. He's kept separate, not in privilege but in protection. In a place where reputation can decide your fate, being him is dangerous. One inmate once said, "We don't see him. We just feel when he's around." Because when his name echoes down the corridor, conversation stops. It's not fear of him, it's fear of what his story represents. A reminder that monsters can wear ordinary faces. The guards know this too. They don't talk much, but their eyes say enough. They describe him as quiet, polite, distant, always composed. He doesn't argue, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't ask for much. He follows rules with precision as if he's still studying them. One officer, speaking off record, said, "He looks through you, not at you." Another said, "He watches everything. It's like he's still in class taking notes." His cell sits in a section designed for isolation. Thick walls, reinforced glass, constant surveillance. Every movement is recorded. Every sound captured. Even his rare walks to visitation or legal meetings are timed, monitored, and silent. The air in this place feels heavy, like it's holding secrets. The clang of closing doors. The murmur of voices behind concrete. The distant echo of a radio fading down the hall. It's an environment that feeds on quiet, where time crawls and noise means danger. Some inmates joke about him. Others refuse to say his name. But late at night, when the lights dim and footsteps echo in the dark, even the toughest men admit, there's something unsettling about knowing he's just a few doors away. To the outside world, he's the accused killer, the criminology student turned suspect. Inside these walls, he's something else, a presence, a symbol of silence that moves through the corridors like a shadow. And while others count their days, he counts something different: patterns, sounds, routines. The scientist inside him never sleeps. Here he's not feared because of what he might do. He's feared because no one can tell what's going on inside his mind. Inmates whisper his name, but few have seen his face. And for some that's enough. Because in a place built to break men, mystery is the most dangerous thing of all. They say death brings silence. But for some, silence is death, stretched out day after day without end. Inside the cell, Bryan Kohberger breathes, eats, sleeps, and waits. The world outside moves forward, but in here time stands still. Every hour sounds the same: the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint clink of keys, the echo of a lock sliding into place. Nothing changes. Nothing ends. The question has been whispered through courtrooms, across news desks, and behind closed doors. Is this punishment worse than death? Experts have spent years studying men who live like this, alone in a space smaller than the average bathroom. They describe it as a slow disintegration of the self. The body survives, but the mind begins to crumble. Thoughts loop endlessly. Emotions flatten. The sense of being human starts to fade. Death ends. But the mind, it lingers. Execution takes seconds. Isolation takes years. It does not strike, it drains. A quiet, invisible erosion of everything that makes a person someone. Psychologists call it mental decay. Prisoners call it living death. And somewhere in the middle lies the truth, that a man can keep breathing long after he's stopped living. Some say it's justice. That this is the cost of the crimes he's accused of. Others call it cruelty, punishment that eats the mind before the law ever claims the body. But for him there are no arguments, no debates. Only the endless rhythm of confinement. The body adapts. The mind does not. The lights hum. The air hums. Even the silence hums. And each day inside, something in him grows quieter. Death is final. Isolation is infinite. And for Bryan Kohberger, trapped in a cell that never sleeps, death might almost seem like mercy, because death ends. But the mind, it lingers. Justice. We speak of it as if it is pure, balanced, unshakable. But what happens when justice begins to resemble suffering? When the pursuit of fairness feels more like the slow decay of another human soul? Bryan Kohberger sits alone, day after day, stripped of touch, stripped of noise, stripped of choice. To the world, that's justice. To him, it might be something far worse. There was a time when punishment was meant to correct, to end a story cleanly. Now it lingers. It stretches into years of isolation, until the walls become the judge, and silence becomes the sentence that we tell ourselves it's right. We tell ourselves it's deserved. But when a man begins to disappear into his own mind, when the punishment becomes psychological rather than physical, are we still seeking justice? Or are we feeding something darker within ourselves? Maybe what frightens us most isn't his crime, but what his silence mirrors in us. Our capacity to watch someone slowly unravel and call it balance. The trial still waits ahead. A future written in court dates and locked doors. For Bryan Kohberger, time no longer moves forward, it circles. The same walls, the same steps, the same silence that he may never walk free again. And maybe that's what he fears most. Not the judgment. Not even death. But the endless waiting, the not knowing. Outside his cell, the world speculates. Inside there are no voices, no faces, only thoughts that echo and fade into the cold. Each night ends the same way it began, with nothing but breathing and the hum of the light above him that he studies the ceiling like it holds answers. It doesn't. It only reminds him that the mind can become its own cage, one far worse than steel and stone. In the end, justice doesn't always end with a verdict. Sometimes, it lives in the silence that follows. He thought understanding evil would give him control over it. Now it surrounds him, presses against him, breathes with him. And in that stillness he faces what the world no longer needs to say, that this is his forever. Maybe justice isn't about punishment. Maybe it's about reflection. Maybe it's about seeing what happens when a man is left alone with everything he's done, and everything he can't escape. Do you think life in isolation is worse than the death penalty? Tell us your thoughts below. And if you want to follow more real human stories like this, subscribe. There's always more to uncover.